you act as an independent Fed governor, or you can act as a political kind of stooge, if you will, of the president.
Right.
And he vowed up and down that he would remain independent and believes in the Fed's independence. Democrats on the panel did not believe him. They thought it was all talk, lip service.
Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle. I'm joined today by economics reporter Zach Halaschak. And Zach, inflation has obviously been a hot topic for quite a while now. We keep getting new numbers, different gauges of how inflation is measured. What's the latest?
So we got two fresh inflation reports in this week, and that comes a week before the Federal Reserve meets to decide what to do next on interest rates. So there's a lot of attention on those two reports. The first one was the producer price index, and that's kind of in some degree measures wholesale inflation, but that's kind of a misnomer. But that essentially fell 0.7 of a percentage point down to like 2.6%. So that was a good thing. Obviously, anytime we see inflation moving close to that Fed's 2% target, it's always welcome news. And then we had the CPI, which is probably the most closely watched gauge of inflation.
Right.
Yeah, the consumer price index. And that increased up to 2.9%. Now, you might expect people to kind of be upset about that or freak out, but markets actually rallied because there was concerns that it would tick up even higher, and then it would show that inflation is still this lingering sticky force. And yes, inflation's up on an annual basis, and yes, it's still higher than expected, but it's not high enough that markets think that the Fed is going to hold off on cutting interest rates. So this tees up the scenario for next week. It appears all but certain that the Fed will cut interest rates by most likely 1/4 of a percentage point, although some investors are betting even bigger cut. But yeah, it's going to be that would mark the first time rates were cut since Trump entered office, the first time in 2025, and comes after months of Trump and his allies, agitating for lower rates. So it's a big deal.
And so have the revisions of the jobs numbers played a role in that as well? Perhaps the view that the labor market isn't quite as strong as people thought? They
played a massive role in it. And, the Fed has what's called a dual mandate. So on one hand, they have price stability, which is keeping inflation in check. And you generally can do that by raising interest rates and, suppressing demand. And then you have the full employment or the employment side of the mandate. And that's making sure the labor market, the unemployment rate is as low as possible and that people have jobs and people who want jobs get jobs. So now that it appears there's some weakness in the labor market, you mentioned the downward revisions on the July jobs report, but also we just got in revisions over the past years, the year before March. So we had like 911,000 fewer jobs than were expected. It shows the labor market isn't as solid as we might have thought at first. That means the Fed is more open to cutting rates to spur the economy because there's a concern, given that unemployment is a lagging indicator, that we could be heading toward a downturn, and they want to make sure that the economy is shored up and people have jobs.
What's going on with President Trump's attempts to sort of reshape the composition of the Federal Reserve? He's got a nominee. Where do things stand currently?
Yeah, Stephen Miran. Adriana Kugler, who was a Fed governor, she unexpectedly resigned, I think it was about a month and a half ago, and that opened up a spot on that 12-person board, FOMC, the Federal Open Market Committee, the committee that decides what to do with interest rates. Now, Trump, as we said, has been agitating for lower interest rates for quite some time, so this is a key opportunity for him to put an ally on the board, someone who wants lower interest rates on the board. And he chose Stephen Miran, who's now head of the Council of Economic Advisors. So, as I said, this is teeing up the meeting next week. They kind of breezed them through the confirmation process, or are in the process of confirming him very quickly, much quicker than one might expect for a normal vacancy on the Fed board. So Miran went through his confirmation hearing before the Senate Banking Committee. And the big topic of conversation there was Fed independence. And he was asked several times, will you act as an independent Fed governor, or you can act as a political kind of stooge, if you will, of the president?
Right.
And he vowed up and down that he would remain independent and believes in the Fed's independence. Democrats on the panel did not believe him. They thought it was all talk, lip service. And another thing that Democrats were upset about is he decided to step away from the CEA, and he's not resigned. So he's like on a temporary leave of absence if he gets confirmed to the Fed. Fed. And the Fed is designed to be very independent by its nature. It's not even funded by Congress. It funds its own finances. And there's various other levers in place, like 14-year terms, that try to keep that separation between the executive and the Fed. And so a lot of Democrats are upset that he took that leave of absence, because he said, look, you still have a tie to the administration, and you're going to be in here deciding what to do with interest rates. Now, all that to be said, it's just one seat on the board.
Right.
So it's a 12-person board, and it's a majority vote. And I don't think he'll have too much of like an influence on actually swaying monetary policy, but it is a step in the right direction for Trump and his allies, who've been trying to get a more favorable FOMC and a more favorable environment at the Fed for interest rate cuts.
And so Trump appointees are also starting to really make their imprint known on the FTC as well, no?
Yeah, I actually sat down with one of the new FTC commissioners, Mark Meador, and we discussed a variety of topics in the antitrust world. He's an interesting character because the way the FTC board is constructed is there's Republican commissioners and there's Democratic commissioners.
Right.
He's a Republican commissioner, but his philosophy toward antitrust policy is kind of different than Republican commissioners of years past, more populist, more in the strain of Trumpism and this kind of wave away from corporate Wall Street Republicanism. His mantra, I think, can be distilled down into big is bad. And so on the FTC board, traditionally, Democrats have been wary of big corporations, big business, mergers, that sort of thing. And Republicans have not been, but at the same time, Democrats have been fine with sort of big government, that sort of thing. And Republicans have been very highly skeptical of large government and more government interventions. He kind of cuts both ways and says, big corporations are just as bad as big government influence, and kind of wants to see there be more of a hand of cutting into these big corporate entities so that it provides more competition. And he thinks that the free market can't just guide itself, but it needs some direction to allow it to be free. So that was kind of the thrust of the conversation. An interesting guy, and it'll be interesting to see kind of what cases he does and some of his work in the coming years.
Thank you, Zach.
Yep.
You can read Zach and the rest of our policy team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.